Hello, my name is Dr. Alex Lindsay. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. And I'm a crop ecophysiologist by training, which essentially means I look at crop physiology in addition to agronomic interactions and how we can manipulate those to kind of interact with one another. And so a lot of my research has focused on abiotic stress tolerance in agronomic crops. And so I'm excited to talk to you today about scouting for environmental stress in our environments. Some of the work that I'm going to highlight is some of our research trial work. Some of it is also just general suggestions on things you might need to look for during the summer as these environmental interactions come up. So I mentioned that my research focus has been on abiotic stress tolerance in agronomic crops. And a lot of that's driven because of what we've been seeing with regards to weather extremes. Over the last few decades, we've seen shifts in our precipitation patterns and distribution in much of the country. In parts of the Midwest where we're located here, we've seen about a 5 to 10% increase in precipitation from 1991 through 2012 compared to the values from 1901 to 1960. In the Northeast part of the country, that's been a little bit greater, and there's been some variance in kind of the Central Plains states. But regardless, the precipitation seems to be shifting to some degree compared to what it's been in the past. Additionally, we've seen a change in intense events. We've seen an increasing intensity of events in our region. 37% increase change in heavy precipitation events, 71% in the northeastern part of the United States. So what this could mean is that if our precipitation is increasing and the number of intense events is also increasing, it may lead to periods where we have a lot of water and also periods where we don't have a lot of water coming into our production environments. The future consecutive dry days is predicted to increase for much of the United States, suggesting that the time between rain events may also extend. And this could lead to issues with abiotic stress in our production environments. I mention this because abiotic stress shows up in many different ways. When we think about strong storms, these oftentimes have the potential to cause issues with our crops in the form of lodging and potentially defoliation, like from hail damage or something like that. So this is me standing in front of our research trial in 2013 after a strong storm had come through. I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But essentially it can cause water stress from drought or waterlogging associated with that. If you have really strong rain causing issues with ponding and issues with water infiltration. And if we have longer periods between rain events, we may have more frequent drought periods. So that kind of summarizes a little bit about why environmental stresses may become more of a problem when we're thinking about scouting. And I wanted to cover a few different topics in this presentation. I'll start by talking a little bit about the root lodging work in corn that we're doing, and then transition to some of the work we've done looking at flooding and nitrogen interactions in corn production crops. We'll talk a little bit about flooding with soybeans as well, and then transition into some of the situations with heat and drought stress and things that might appear in the field. After that, we'll switch from hot temperatures to cold temperatures and talk a little bit about corn and wheat production. And we'll wrap up with a little bit of information on herbicide damage that may be evident in crops. So I mentioned wind. Wind is often a stress that we may not necessarily think about, but it can be a problem in our crop production environments. I mentioned it can come with heavy rains. It can also cause emotional stress like it did for me here. The day before, the corn was over my head. Everything was going well. The next day I came out, my entire field was flattened. I was worried I wasn't going to get my PhD at that point, given the stress, but luckily things worked out. The crop was able to respond, and I was able to move forward. But the point I'm trying to make here is that sometimes we can get stress from weather events in the absence of insect pests. Oftentimes when we think of wind stress, we consider this to be an abiotic response that can show up in two forms. We can either have green snap or brittle snap with the stalk, where essentially a stalk is completely broken above a node on the plant. This is a very common form of damage that occurs in the V10 to V15 growth stage range. So it's more common in vegetative stages. And something that may need to be done is check for stalk borer damage. If there's stalk borers that are affecting the stalk quality, potentially this could increase susceptibility to green snap. But green snap can occur whether or not there's an insect pest there or not, if the winds are strong enough and the plant is at the right growth stage. If the plant doesn't break, it may end up bending, which can cause root lodging. Essentially what happens there is the stalk is intact, but the leaves act almost like a wind sail. They'll collect the wind and pull the plant over so that the root mass is partially removed from the soil. You may check those plants for corn rootworm feeding or other root diseases to see if the root quality is high, but just be aware that this type of stress can occur in the absence of disease or insect pests at the same time. I mentioned this because we had some opportunities to collect data on 7 different planting experiments in the years of 2011, 2012, and 2013. In each study, we had different seeding rate trials conducted with a population range from 18,000 seeds per acre to 50,000 seeds per acre, and hybrids ranging in maturity from 102 to 120 days. In each one of these years, we actually had really strong storms come through during the late vegetative stages, causing wind lodging. In 2011, we had the derecho come through, where essentially strong straight line winds were coming through Ohio, and then a second round was generated and caused issues with wind stress. In 2012, the derecho originated in northwestern Indiana and proceeded to stretch across the entire state of Ohio, resulting in pretty severe lodging damage. In 2013, while the derecho wasn't recorded in July, around July 10th, we had really strong storms associated with heavy rainfall and 3 tornadoes throughout the state, which caused the damage that I showed on the previous slides with me standing in that field. From that data, we were able to kind of compile this and look at the association between root lodging and green snap susceptibility associated with seeding rate. And what we saw was that there was a strong relationship between the incidence of root lodging and corn seeding rate, where as seeding rate increased, susceptibility to root lodging increased. This could be partially due to the changing architecture of the roots as they're grown in higher densities. It could also be associated with how the above ground growth was changing, especially in those vegetative growth stages. But that's something that we noticed in those trials. Interestingly, there wasn't really an association with green snap incidence and planting population in those trials where we collected that data. So I mentioned a lot of this happened during the vegetative stages, but we can also get lodging during the reproductive stages, as we saw this past year. So this is showing satellite imagery from Iowa, where the large swaths of color change were an association with a derecho that came through. It caused widespread damage, crop loss, stalk breakage, leaf defoliation. These images were borrowed from Twitter for the purposes of this presentation. And ultimately, it was noticed that there was some deterioration of the root systems, which could affect grain fill, completion, and even harvestability. So interestingly, we started a trial in 2018 that wrapped up in 2020 that was looking at how root lodging impacts yield production in corn with 2 objectives. One was to evaluate the effect of root lodging on grain yield using contemporary hybrids and seeding rates, given what we saw from our observational data. And the second objective was to see if we could figure out why yield was being affected because of lodging. So we collected many different measurements, including silking date, total leaf number, dominant ear leaf number, light interception, total stalk length, and final upright recovery rating at R4. We quantified grain yield and moisture, but then also collected ears from those plots to see if they were barren or they had ears with very few kernels, and also if they had ear abnormalities associated with them. In the trial that we saw this past summer over the last 3 years, we saw that silking date was slightly elongated when lodging occurred at the V13 growth stage. It took about an extra day for the plants to get to silking as compared to when lodging wasn't imposed or was imposed at an earlier growth rate. So there was some slight delay in phenological development in those plots. We also noticed that the final curve stalk length, so this is not only the curvature of the stalk, but also the remaining stalk height as well. We added up the linear components of that stalk. We noticed that in the V10 and the V13 treatments, the stalk length was less than in our other treatments, suggesting these plants were putting more energy towards correcting their growth to be upright again, as opposed to fully devoting it to internode elongation. Some of the ear abnormalities that we rated for included vivipary. Essentially, we looked at the ears. If we had any kernels that were sprouted on the ear, those were counted as a viviparous ear. And so this was tended to be more of a problem when the ears were in close proximity to the soil and they weren't able to dry out. But this is something to keep in mind with regards to grain quality and test weight issues and potential grain marketability if this is highly prevalent. We also rated for incidence of zippering. Essentially, this was done on a 1 to 5 scale where 1 was nothing, 5 is severe. But when zippering occurs, essentially the back half of the ear looks okay. You flip the ear over and you see these types of patterns appearing. Almost like there's a zipper effect or some of the rows are missing due to incomplete pollination or something of that nature. We rated for kernel jumbling as well. So looking at pollination success in those ears, essentially on a scale of 1 to 5 again, where 5 is the most severe abnormal. And then we looked at basal emptiness of the ears. So pollination was okay on most of the ear aside from the bottom. So that was kind of what we were looking at there with some of those ear abnormalities. When we compiled the data and looked at the yield response over time, we saw that the yield reductions were significant from root lodging, regardless of when it occurred. It was about a 5% yield loss at the V10 stage, 22% yield loss at the V13 stage, 43% at the VT or R1, the pollinating phase, and 33% yield loss at R3. The yield loss was most severe during the pollination phase, and we also saw the greatest number of barren plants and more zippering in those ears, indicating poor pollination, or something was happening with the silk emergence that could have affected pollination success. The R3 treatments, while the yield loss wasn't as great, these had the greatest percentage of viviparous ears and had lower kernel weights than any other treatment, suggesting that grain fill was negatively impacted. So in summary, the yield losses we saw in the current study were slightly greater than were previously reported in trials that were done in the US in the 1980s. We also had higher seeding rates and different relative maturities, which could also suggest why those yield losses were slightly greater in the current study. The yield loss that we experienced in these trials came from different places. It came from reduced kernel production, poor pollination, and just fewer kernels altogether. And when we had lodging at R3, the biggest concerns were the reduced kernel weight affecting test weight, as well as the increased prevalence of vivipary. Having those germinating kernels on the ear is not a good thing when you're trying to market that grain. I'm going to transition now to talk about the next stress, which is that kind of idea of corn flooding and nitrogen management. So we recently did a trial at Ohio looking at 4 waterlogged conditions ranging from 0 to 6 days of waterlogging. And we paired that with 3 nitrogen treatments, either no nitrogen applied, 120 pounds of nitrogen applied pre-plant incorporated, or 120 pounds pre-plant plus 60 pounds applied after waterlogging was complete, or as a conventional side dress treatment, as we did for the 0-day flood duration. The reason we were interested in looking at this is because flooding can change how the plant grows. Above ground, you can see some changes in leaf area, maybe a reduction in shoot growth, a change in leaf color, possibly. But below ground, you might see a differential response. Instead of halting growth, like we see for above ground, it could expand its growth potential. Initially, you could have an increase in root biomass or area after a flooding event due to the formation of root cortical parenchyma. Essentially, the roots in corn will kill off parenchymal cells that surround the xylem and phloem bundles, creating air pockets. It also reduces the metabolic draw of those cells and allows that root system to potentially expand at a greater rate. We also looked at the nitrogen component because nitrogen is really important when we talk about flood conditions. Essentially, the nitrogen you applied could be lost to denitrification due to the low oxygen environment. The nitrification process or conversion from ammonium to nitrate tends to be slowed under flooded conditions. And you could experience greater leaching of nitrate out of the root zone when flooding is present. So looking at the impact of the fertilization practices was important for the purposes of this study. What we observed was that flooding delayed development. It did cause things to slow down, especially at the 4 and 6 day flood duration. Those were behind the other treatments by about a full growth stage. The height and biomass also decreased with flooding, but an application tended to help that height recover a little bit better. So at 14 days after flood initiation, we saw that having that early nitrogen application was beneficial to most of our treatments aside from the 6 day flood. By the time we got to 21 days after flooding, that was still helpful for the 4 day situation, but applying that additional 60 pounds really helped to kickstart our plants after that flood was over. We did see the patterns we expected to see with the root situation. Both root length and area increased with flood duration, but biomass didn't change. And this shift was thought to change because of this increase in porosity. Essentially, root porosity is an indirect measure of root parenchymal formation. And we saw an increase in that, allowing those roots to expand at a greater capacity as compared to when flooding didn't occur. Looking at the grain yield response, we saw the best yield in the trials that were not flooded and received a full 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre. But we did see that regardless of flood duration, yield responded to that post-flood nitrogen application. Adding 60 pounds of nitrogen after the flooding helped to increase grain yield regardless of our flood duration. But that led to another question of whether or not 60 pounds was enough or if another rate might be beneficial. So we're looking to expand this work to look at some different post-flood nitrogen rates to see if we can kind of hone in on a responsible agronomic recommendation for post-flood nitrogen management. Nitrogen is also really important when we think about flooded soybeans. One of the biggest issues we see when soybeans become flooded is that their nitrogen fixation potential is reduced because nodulation may not be as prevalent. So getting those soybeans back to nodulating can be really critical. After the field dries, you can always check to see if nodules are starting to develop on those soybeans. And if they are, then usually things will continue to progress. But sometimes the flooding is so severe that the nodules may not form. And so you may ultimately have to come back with a supplemental nitrogen application to help those plants make yield at a reasonable level. The other issue we can see with flooded soybean fields that's usually more prevalent as compared to corn flooding is the incidence of water mold infection. So you may see an increased prevalence of Phytophthora later in the season if that oomycete is usually a problem in those fields. So it's something to keep in mind and to scout for, that once the flooding is gone, the problems may still persist. Sticking with soybeans, I'm going to switch to talking about those with regards to high temperature or drought conditions. Essentially, under high temperatures or drought conditions, soybeans may start to change their leaf orientation to better deal with that stress. And so the soybean field goes from being a deep dark green to more of a silvery color. And part of that's because the leaf orientation is almost inverted. Those leaves start to wilt even if there's enough water present. The vapor pressure deficit is so great that those leaves are saying, I can't transpire anymore. I got to do something. And so it starts to shift its orientation. And so you might see the underside of leaves start to become more prevalent in your field. As a result, that may lead to greater interception of that leaf surface with light. And as that light comes in, it can cause some bronzing for some of our soybean varieties. We saw this in one of our trials where some varieties tended to bronze a little bit more severely than other varieties. And so this may be something that is variety specific, but it's something to be aware of. Watch the weather, watch what the soybean fields are doing. And if you get a call about bronzed leaf tissue, or they think some sort of blight is coming in, make sure you check those leaves, because it could just be essentially sunburn. When we think about high temperature and drought stress, the major concern when we think about soybeans is the impact on flower and pod formation. High incidence of drought or high temperatures can often lead to poor pod set, which can ultimately reduce yield. So doing a check on these and seeing how things are progressing throughout the season may be informative to help producers understand what the implications might be on yield at the end of the season. Sometimes we have to think about cold temperatures as well. Sometimes we have our corn planted and then we get cool nights, cool days, and we get lots of sun. And in some cases, we can have this occur, and then the plants start to take on this type of phenotype. The leaf edges start to turn purple, and there's concerns possibly this is associated with phosphorus availability or phosphorus fertilization. Many times, the phosphorus levels are okay, the roots are okay. It's just the cool conditions and the high light conditions trigger anthocyanin production within the leaf tissue. As the corn photosynthesizes, it essentially creates sucrose, which then it wants to load into the phloem and move to the actively growing part of the plants. But when conditions are cool, this process can be slowed, and it can lead to a buildup of sucrose in the leaf tissue. One of the responses plants have to a buildup of sucrose is the formation of anthocyanins. Essentially, it's forming sunblock within its tissue to try to minimize damage from so much light. Usually, these symptoms will alleviate over time, and so this purpling will tend to go away as the temperatures warm up. Sometimes, though, they may not go away, and you may want to check with the producer to see what the herbicide program was, because oftentimes herbicides that aren't labeled for use in corn can cause reddish tissue to start to form within the plant tissue and could be indicative of another issue. So it's always good to confirm the herbicide regime when seeing this type of damage, but in general, this type of thing will go away with time. Another crop that can experience damage to cold temperatures is wheat. So this is something we've seen in Ohio recently. Oftentimes our wheat crop is vernalized and it starts to resume its reproductive growth. It'll start to send out its shoots and ultimately will be starting to flower, but we've been getting these odd events. I know Kentucky experienced them, Ohio's experienced them as well, where we get cold temperatures around the time of wheat flowering, which can potentially cause issues with seed set, pollination, and seed fill. When we think about yield reduction, essentially a temperature of 26 degrees Fahrenheit was enough to reduce yield by 25% when wheat was in the flowering stage, peaks 10.5.1. And again, this was at 15 minutes of exposure. And so if you start to see symptomology like this, where leaves are rolling, heads are kind of bent or crimped, it may be indicative that that field experienced cold temperatures around the time of heading or flowering. You may want to confirm the herbicide program because leaf rolling may be associated with some growth regulator herbicides, but oftentimes when we see this type of damage, it's associated with odd temperatures. Keep in mind as well that some parts of the field may be more affected than others based on if they're in a valley or on a hilltop. And also, if a temperature inversion occurs, the air temperature may actually be warmer than the temperature of the leaf tissue. And so you may end up seeing these even if temperatures are close to freezing but not below. So it's something to keep in mind. and scout for moving forward. Finally, just be aware that there could be some herbicide symptomology that shows up that's not necessarily environmental, but it's also not caused by a pathogen. Some herbicides in soybeans, for instance, are ones that can cause necrotic spots to appear. And so just understanding what the herbicide regime was and being familiar with the symptomology could help to save some stress or alleviate some concerns of the producer. Sometimes even if a herbicide or a crop is herbicide tolerant, you may still see some symptomology of the herbicide if there is a higher rate or temperatures are cool again, which limits metabolism. So things like glyphosate flash may appear even if the crop is herbicide tolerant, depending on the environmental conditions. But that pretty much summarizes what I had brought to the table today. Just remember that crops can respond after environmental stress. Some yield loss is expected, but oftentimes they're a little bit more resilient than one may expect. Always look for injury from other possible sources to try to rule those out when considering environmental stress symptomology. And keep in mind that management practices may make a difference with regards to what the symptoms look like or how quickly a crop can respond. I'd like to acknowledge the workers in my lab for helping to collect the data and the information that I presented today, as well as the farm managers at Ohio State for helping us maintain those crop trials. The funding for the research presented today came from the OEREC Seeds program at Ohio State University, as well as the Crop Management Research Award program from DuPont Pioneer. And with that, I really appreciate your attention. Thanks again for your attendance. I hope this goes well for you and you get a lot of good information. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. Thanks again.